And today, I'm really excited because this is the first of these professional learning sessions where we're actually talking about how you can integrate the clusters into the classroom. So we will be looking at how you can do that as a science teacher. So let me just get my slides together. And in this session, we're going to be talking about 4 key things. So we've got about half an hour. It might take a little bit longer, especially if we've got some great questions. But we're going to be looking at the role of the teacher within the classroom and within the career development process. So it's actually a lot bigger than most teachers. When I speak with them about this, more than they actually think. They have a much bigger role to play than they imagine that they do. We're going to also be looking at what the clusters are. So if you've never heard of them before, then you'll be able to get your heads around how they work. And then we're going to go and talk about how which careers in science, or how does science relate to careers in each cluster. And finally, we'll finish off by having a look at some of the ways that you can use the clusters within your classroom if that's something that you would like to do. So what we know, what the evidence actually shows us, is that teachers are actually the second most important influence in a young person's career development after parents. It's actually a really huge role that teachers play. And most of them don't know that it's this significant, that they actually play this bigger role in the career decision-making process. But when we look at the surveys and at the research, when we ask young people, that's what they tell us, is that teachers and the impact of the teachers has a really big impact on what they decide to do and on who they decide to become. Most of the time, teachers will tell you that's not the case. They don't have that kind of influence, but it is. And how it works is that it works in micro conversations. So it's in those moments where you might be talking about something within your classroom and you decide to connect it to a career, or a career comes up, a student asks you about a particular career, or you're watching a career story, and then the teacher will say something about that career. And that is what the student takes on board. So the teacher's opinions or ideas or thoughts around that career and about its relevance to the young person. So it is a really influential role that teachers play within that career development process. And to back it up, I actually got this quote this morning from one of our teachers, Anna, who was a science teacher and is now a careers advisor. And she's explaining how she finds it so important because when she was teaching STEM, if she wasn't able to connect her lessons to the real world, if she wasn't able to show how they were relevant, then she would feel like she would sometimes lose the students. We know that people working in my industry know that science skills and STEM skills are super important for a huge range of jobs, well outside of what you would consider to be a typical science job. But those skills can really set people up across a huge range of industries. And we also know that students who understand the point of what they're learning, when they understand how it's relevant, that they're more likely to be engaged cognitively and emotionally. So that means that they're more likely to actually pay attention, they're more likely to engage on a deeper level and gain a deeper understanding of the content, and perform better in class and have better outcomes for themselves and for you as well as their teacher. So there are lots of reasons why you would want to connect your classroom content with careers. The problem is that I have 3 teenagers myself, and I spend a lot of time talking to young people. And the reality is that they can't often join the dots for themselves. So you might have a beautiful lesson, a beautiful science lesson, but unless you've shown the young people how that lesson is going to impact or going to be relevant for their real lives, they lack the ability to do that themselves, because most of the time they've got this really very limited understanding of the workplace and of the workforce, and they can't see for themselves. They don't have the skills and the knowledge to be able to make those connections without your help. They're not very good at joining dots. So what we really need to do is something that looks a lot more like this, where we're actively explaining the sorts of technical skills that your lesson is teaching them, the transferable skills. So outside of the technical science type skills, the more broader skills that they're developing from your lesson, giving them some ideas of jobs that might actually use the content in the lesson, and then also talking about real stories, because we know how important storytelling is in really helping young people engage and get their heads around, kind of get that deeper understanding of context of what that might actually mean for their career. So when we see something like this happening, that's when you start to see the magic happen. And while you can do all of that without using the career clusters, there's no need, you don't have to use the career clusters. We think that when we use the career clusters, it might make it a little bit easier for you. So What we found, we developed the career clusters because we realized that we were using quite old, granular ways of talking about work. There was some research done by the OECD a few years ago, and they surveyed young people 15 years old from right across the world. And they asked them what they expected to be doing at age 30, not what they hoped to be doing, what they aspired to be doing, but what they actually thought they would be doing at the age of 30. And around half of those teenagers that they surveyed thought that they would actually be working at age 30 in just one of 10 jobs. The reality is that there are, about 1,200 official jobs, and then in reality, there's probably tens of thousands of actual jobs out there. So when we know that half of young people are aspiring to just 10 jobs, it's actually quite a narrow range, and we need to be thinking differently about how we can talk about work in order to break people out of those kind of typical ways of thinking. So with the career clusters, what we have are 6 clusters, and I'm not sure, can you see that on the screen? Okay, it's not coming through, but there are 6 clusters, and what I'll do is I'll show you this one instead because it's actually got the clusters on it. And there are the linkers, innovators, guardians, informers, coordinators, and makers. And within each cluster is a group of people who are brought together because they share this really holistic way of working. So it's broader than just a common set of tasks or a common set of like an industry which is producing a certain type of goods. It's a more holistic way of thinking about work. And each group is the people in each group. They share common, like everyday tasks. So the sorts of things they're doing every day are pretty similar, and the ways that they're doing them are pretty similar. They usually have core skill sets, so technical and transferable skill sets that they share. They tend to work in the same sort of environment. So whether that's in an office environment or some sort of physical outdoor setting, or shift hours versus regular hours. And they also tend to share a set of values or outcomes, things they want to actually achieve out of their work. So if you're in the informer category, a cluster, for example, you're probably going to value the same sorts of things as other people who are also informers. It's much easier to get your head around how the clusters work when we actually use an example from industry. So this is an example of the sorts of people that work in each cluster within the science field itself. And you can see that there's a really wide range there, and it goes far beyond what we would typically think of as a scientist or somebody who works in science. So we're bringing in those people who are selling the end products that science have developed and researched. We're talking about people who are using their scientific knowledge and skills to be able to monitor safety or to help people work out, their nutritional schedules. So there's all these different things that kind of fit within the science field that you wouldn't maybe typically think of. And that's what the clusters do so well, is they really make invisible jobs visible. So if you ask a group of 15-year-olds what what sort of jobs come from science, they're probably going to come up with things like scientist. You might get marine biologist or an engineer perhaps, but they're generally going to be those quite what we call hero jobs, the visible jobs. So the ones that you would think of off the top of your head. But when we start to use the clusters, we can start to see that actually science can lead to careers in a whole range of different industries and different areas, and that the skills and knowledge that you gain from the science classroom can be used in all of these different places. So whether you go into government and you're writing environmental policy, for example, or if you're working in the trades, so maybe you're an electrician, you're going to be needing some of that science knowledge there as well. So when we start to use the clusters, we can sort of break away from that science equals scientist concept and start to explore some of those other things that are available. So let's just have a really quick look at each cluster in detail. And before we do that, these are the overall results that we've got so far from students. So around 5,000 students have shared their results, their career cluster results with us. And it's important to note this because within your classroom, it'll be unique. The makeup will be unique, but it probably won't be that you're going to have 6 equally sized, neat little groups of people who fit in each cluster. So you're going to have possibly more guardians. We see a lot of informers as well. There's a chance that there will be probably less coordinators and makers. Overall, this isn't overly problematic because some of those roles that sit within coordinator and maker, they tend to be roles that might be more at risk of automation, whereas guardians and informers and innovators We need a lot of people to move into healthcare, for example, aged care, disability care. So it's actually a good thing that we have a little bit of an imbalance, because if we didn't, that might be problematic. But just bear it in mind when we're talking about career development and how you're going to, bring these clusters into your classroom, that you're not going to have 6 little evenly spaced groups. So we'll go through them one by one. The first is the guardians. They're really dedicated to health and well-being. So they're passionate about health and well-being. So people who we would normally think of as guardians will be doctors, nurses, pharmacists, dentists, all those kind of people that you think of in healthcare. But we also bring people who help us maintain our health and well-being, so fitness trainers, people who help us maintain our appearance, so beauty therapists, and also people who help us keep safe. So we include a huge range of people in there, including our police forces, our emergency services, occupational health and safety officers, all of those kinds of people who are there primarily to keep people safe and well. They sit within the Guardian cluster. In the science space, there's actually quite a lot of crossover, not necessarily pure scientists. So if we're talking about a medical researcher, you might originally think of that person as like a healthcare person first, with the science sort of second, but there's quite a lot of crossover, because so many of these people who are working in health, they need to be talking about life systems, living systems, biology, things that we would normally associate with science. It's important to note that we also include people in here who have they have a real need to understand science, but you wouldn't think of them normally as science at all. So beauty therapist, I love including that one in this space because it's so popular for young people. But beauty therapists, they really do need a strong knowledge of chemical formulas to be able to apply them appropriately for their clients. So they do need that science knowledge if they want to be a beauty therapist. Students who are guardians, they usually, we see them more into biology than maybe physics or sort of space science or environmental science. It's that real life sciences. And they want to understand how the science will actually impact on humans. So how can they use what they're learning in class to hopefully help us live better lives? And they also want to know about the ethical considerations. So what does it actually mean if we're developing something, saying we're talking about genetics? If we're talking about genetics in class, then what are the ethical considerations of that? And somebody who is a guardian in your classroom might be really interested in actually learning the ethical considerations rather than just what is actually possible. And they might use the science that they learn in your classroom to actually go on into their careers. They might actually take that with them. And if we're wanting to engage guardians within the classroom, the first thing to note is it's really important to keep it achievable. So there's a tendency when we start talking about science and guardians to go straight to thinking about like neurosurgeons. But the reality is that's not a career path that's going to be applicable for the majority of your students. So when we start to bring in those other roles, like our beauty therapist that I was talking about earlier, we can keep it achievable and they can start to connect themselves and relate themselves to those careers. And you can also relate your lessons to the health things and the sort of things the decisions that they're making right now. So are they taking any medication or have they taken any medication lately? Talking about drugs and alcohol and the other sorts of things that they might interact with, their own life systems. Do they have a relative who's elderly who they're looking after, who they might be supporting as well? So start to bring the things that they're doing today and they're already lived experience within the classroom when you're talking about careers as well. So the makers are really highly competent technicians. They operate things like equipment, machinery, technology, and they really make things happen. So they're quite process driven, quite hands-on, and very good at making things run the way that they should. Within a science space, we have people who are lab techs who are going to fit within that space. They might be maintaining lab equipment or making sure that it runs properly or just running a lab generally. But the majority of people who are makers don't necessarily work within science, but they're still going to use some of that understanding in their own spaces. So an electrician, for example, is going to be relying on physics when they're actually performing their role. The same with a brewer. They're going to be using things like microbiology and chemistry and they're going to have to really understand that fermentation process. And at the end of the day, that's a chemical process. So they're going to use those science skills they've learned in class, maybe not all of them in class, in their work when they're out there working. Students who are makers, they're really interested in not just knowing that something happens, but they want to know how it happens. So they want to be able to understand the process and unpack that process and how it got to that point. So then they can resolve all those things in their mind and understand it the way that they would like. There are often people who are really keen on hands-on learning, and they might also be looking for ways to really optimize the process. So, if they're conducting an experiment, how can they do that quite safely using their equipment, using new technology? How can they really take it to the next level? And if we want to engage them within a science classroom, that's great because science classrooms often mimic what a maker might experience in the workforce. So they'll be operating equipment, they'll be having to think about things like occupational health and safety or keeping themselves safe, having to maintain their workspace. And these are all really strong maker skills. So when they're actually working within your science classroom, they'll be able to bring those skills they learn in your classroom and then go and use them in whatever they do later. They also are going to want to understand how the theory that you're teaching them relates to the real world, so to actual procedures. So, if you're talking about physics, for example, and different types of energy, that's what my daughter's learning about at the minute in science, different types of how we produce energy. You might then want to go and relate that to how is energy produced for your local area. So for us, a lot of our energy is produced by hydroelectric facilities. And you might want to talk about that within your classroom and really bring that in so that they can see, okay, cool, this is a concept that I've got, but then that's how it's actually used in practice. Informers, these are people who have a really large amount of knowledge and experience with one particular area, and then they use that knowledge to go and support other people. So that might mean that they advise and assist people or they guide people. They might actually do some work for you, like an accountant might do your taxes for you. And some informers actually share their knowledge with other people. So science teachers generally fit within the informer cluster. They also tend to be sort of part guardian, part coordinator, part linker, but generally we would put them under the informer cluster. When we're talking about pure science or scientists, they would fall under the category or the cluster of an informer. So when they're conducting research and they're acquiring new knowledge and then they're applying that new knowledge, then they fit with an informer. And when they're using that knowledge or that research to then go and develop solutions to problems, they would start to fall more under that innovator cluster. So depending on how they're working in that space, they're probably going to be an informer or an innovator. And then what they're doing in all of these different spaces is that they're using their research to then create new things, so new technology or new solutions to problems. And there's also some people who work within this cluster who are like agronomists, and they actually use their science-based understanding to then go and support farmers to maybe make their crops more sustainable or to use less pesticides or whatever it is that they're doing. So they're then advising. And students who are informers are going to want to really build a deep knowledge about something so then they can then go and use that knowledge to support other people. And they might really enjoy sharing that knowledge with other people. So that's maybe where you might want to bring in more presentations for those people, those students, and allow them to support other learners. Informers may not always end up working as scientists, but they're going to really need to understand the science to be able to service their clients. So, for example, even if they're not working as researchers, for example, a business advisor who might be an informer working within the science industry, they're going to have quite a strong understanding of science to be able to do that. Linkers are the connectors. So linkers are the people who they bridge the gap between people and the products or the services or the support that they need. And they're really great at building relationships and solving problems. So they fit kind of slightly off the informers and the guardians in that way. And while they're not generally scientists, they may be people who are doing some of their own research and then communicating that research. So if we're talking about science communicators, then they would tend to fit within this linker space because they're not just doing the research, but they're then using it to support other people and to teach others as well. And all sorts of different people within this industry. So they need to have an understanding of the science. If they're going to be able to sell or promote or connect or do whatever it is, they need to actually understand the science to be able to do that. Students who are linkers in your classroom, they really want to know how what they're learning might be able to support others one day. So how could it be useful for a range of people rather than just here's one simple application? Like how could it be used in a range of different diverse settings? And when we're talking about linkers, it's a lot of it is about that dialogue, about that conversation. So how can they use their information and their knowledge to become advocates or to support other people within the space? And with that in mind, when we're talking about how we can engage linker students within a science classroom, that's where we're encouraging debate, we're encouraging discussion, and we're wanting them to think deeper about what they're learning so that then they can go and use that knowledge to support or advocate or whatever it is they want to do for other people, with this real focus on communication. And we also want to start talking about some of the entrepreneurial applications of science. So rather than just talking about the science as a concept or a theory or a skill, saying, great, this is where it might lead, and this is what we might be able to do with that in the future. This is how we might be able to improve or support other people in society, and really taking that entrepreneurial lens to science. Innovators are the creative minds behind all of these different design engineering solutions, and that's what they do. They engineer solutions to the problems that we face. So quite a lot of scientists would fit within this category, particularly if they are actually working maybe in an entrepreneurial space developing new solutions. So that's really similar to informers in that way, and you're going to find pure scientists, or you would normally think of as a scientist within this cluster, but also a whole range of other people. So like a landscape architect, you wouldn't normally think of a landscape architect as a scientist, but they will be needing to use biology and ecology and an understanding of living systems in order to create their designs and then be able to make them sustainable. We've also got web developers, biomedical engineers, all sorts of different people fit within the innovator space from science. And we find that innovator students are really keen to solve problems. So there's that natural kind of fit between a science classroom and the kind of work you would do in a science classroom and what an innovator would normally be attracted to, because they are innovative and they enjoy experimenting and they enjoy trying things out and seeing what works. And so there's that sort of real natural fit there. This is me. When I was growing up, I really enjoyed working on the big science project that we would do each year. We would do one a year. I think we built a bridge out of paddle pop sticks one year and then looked at rusty nails or something another year. But that's what really stood out to me, was that opportunity to really take a piece of information or a piece of knowledge and then extend it and see how I could push it myself and try it further and think outside the box. And when we're talking about supporting those people in the classroom, once again, obviously, we're talking about practical learning, about giving them projects, about letting them connect science-based ideas to innovation and design and where else we could do, and really bringing those real-world applications into that discussion for them so that they can see how they could put their science into practice. Coordinators are experts at keeping everything running. They are the people who plan, organise, manage. And you're going to find coordinators at all levels of an organisation, right from the front desk through to managing the entire company. And within science, we're maybe not going to see coordinators as much actually working as scientists unless they are managing their own projects. They're more likely to be part of a team that's working on something together. So a plant manager at a hydroelectric plant, for example, might not need to know every single aspect of how the plant works, but they're going to have a pretty good understanding to be able to manage that team and to be able to make all those things happen. So we've got a whole heap of different roles here. My mum was actually a clinical research manager while I was growing up. So she wasn't a scientist, she was originally a nurse, but she had quite a large amount of information about the pharmaceutical drugs that they were trialing, about the processes and the experimentation, the trial processes that they would go through. And she used all of that to keep everything on track, make sure that everything was done properly and ethically, and keep all of the doctors and the scientists, manage their project for them. So for students who are coordinators, they might be more focused in your classroom on the actual processes rather than the knowledge itself. They're going to be the methodical and organised students, the ones who've got those fantastic notebooks full of beautiful highlighted notes, and who turn up on time. And because science can require them to be quite organised, often the processes that you go through, the experimentation processes that you go through, are quite well organised. You can really use that to teach them or to allow them to explore and develop those management and administration skills that they've already got and that they lean towards. And they're probably also going to want to be looking for ways to make the process more efficient. And as I said before, you're going to have probably two paths with coordinators, whether they are managing their own projects or whether they're helping manage other science-based projects. So if you're wanting to do that either way, you can show them how real-life projects are managed and give them real examples of how science projects or scientific projects are run in the real world and how that process evolves, not just the research and not just the actual science process, but the whole holistic way of looking at it. So the reality is that that was the clusters, but it's all about the conversation. So the clusters are just the tool, they're just a vehicle that you can use to have conversations about careers within your classroom, and they give you a really neat and tidy kind of framework to then go and structure those other conversations. We know that young people don't work out what they're going to do when they leave school in one sitting. They don't sit down for 45 minutes and then make some decisions, and that's the extent of it. It's actually a really long, drawn-out process. So with the clusters, we can allow them to build how they feel about different careers and to think about it a bit deeper and think about where they might fit. And it gives you a bit of a framework to do all of that. You might want to do this in two ways. So the first is if you're actually planning a lesson, so incorporating the careers within lesson planning, you might be looking for places where you can slot in a little bit of information about careers or a little bit of information about a particular job or a career story or an example. Look for those natural places where you can fit that to really bring them back to the point of the conversation in the first place and engage the students again. But then also have that information in the back of your mind, maybe even if it is just a case of Googling what careers are related to this particular lesson before you start for the day, so that when those questions come up, you're feeling confident and you're feeling like you understand how that all works, and then you can provide those answers to the students or you can help them go find them themselves. And we've got a couple of suggestions for how you can have career conversations in your classroom. So there's only 4 suggestions. And the first one is to keep things simple and start thinking smaller. So it doesn't need to be a full 40-minute lesson talking about careers. You can keep it really small, really quick. And as long as the student understands and has that little, aha moment, that's all you're really looking for with the career-related information. So you might want to use it as an icebreaker at the start of your class. So say, hey, today we're going to be covering this. This is somebody who uses it in the real world, and this is how they use it in the real world. Students go, oh, cool, I get it now. And then they're focused for the entire lesson because they can see how it relates to their real lives. We've actually got some resources that I will send out to you afterwards that can help you do this as well. So career conversation cards, just as really tiny little thinking points for you. The second way is to get them to give you the answer. So you don't have to do all the work for them. You can just be prompting them to think about the careers that might relate to what you're studying today. And when I do this with students, what I find is that they often have quite bright ideas that I couldn't have thought of myself because they're looking at it from a different angle and they're bringing their own different experiences. So feel free to encourage them to control the conversation, to run the conversation themselves and to come up with the answers for themselves. And the reality is that there isn't a right or wrong. There's not one job that sits 100% within one particular cluster and it never moves between. The reality is that our careers are dynamic and flexible. So they can't really get this wrong. The next is to join the dots for them. So as I said right at the start, do not expect young people to be able to join the dots. I think I've got children of my own, teenagers of my own, and I think they can't join the dots between coming home and seeing dishes on the bench and actually packing the dishwasher. So they're not going to be able to make those kind of connections by themselves. They have very limited experience of the workplace. They have usually whatever experience they do have is limited to maybe 1 or 2 areas. And it's not that they don't want to, it's that they literally lack the ability, the experience and the skills to make the connections. So that means that it's not really enough to just say, and here's a job that relates to today's lesson. You have to actually explain how that job relates to today's lesson because they won't be able to see that necessarily for themselves. And the last tip is to include a whole range of jobs. So go way beyond those visible, really key sort of hero jobs that we were talking about earlier. Don't just focus on the shiny jobs. Think about all of the different jobs that are out there. And if you like, use the clusters to separate it out. So today we're going to be talking about coordinators in this particular content area. because that way you're including more of the students who don't see themselves as a typical scientist, and you're allowing them to still see how what you're learning in class might relate to their career, even if on the face of it, that's got nothing to do with science. In my experience, students really love it when they get the point of what they're learning and they really value your insight. So you are the expert for them and that you bring something to the conversation that they can't get anywhere else. And that when you're doing this, when you're connecting what you're teaching with career paths, you're really helping them gauge and see the value of their learning. And that's what gets them and me really excited.